Thank you very much. We're honored to be here on behalf of the NCRI, a US-based organization. I thought maybe just to set a little bit of a stage of who we are. My name is Adam Sohn. I'm the CEO of the Network Contagion Research Institute. We developed methodologies, we have technology, and we have research that we've developed over the last 5 years that identifies and forecasts cyber-social threats. And we've done this in a variety of different areas. We've looked at this in the public health sector. So we've worked with organizations like Google and Walmart to identify issues impacting the success or failure of vaccine distribution at the height of COVID and the introduction of the vaccine. We work with the U.S. Attorney's Office on issues regarding manipulation of the capital markets and issues related to cryptocurrencies and actually now just people's ordinary 401k. It's gotten much worse instead of better, and the regulators in the United States, FTC, SEC, and others are far behind. And then other issues in terms of vulnerable communities, which is how we came to know the Ruderman Foundation. The NCRI just completed the largest study of its kind in the world, working with the UK government Office of Communications on self-harm and suicide in children. So with that, we've attracted a lot of attention from the law enforcement and the intelligence community, lawmakers in the United States, people that have now reached out to join our board, who will be joining our board. General John Allen, 4-star general of the United States Marines, who led the United States military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also, Jean Tysinger, first female, actually, chief information officer of the CIA, is also joining the NCRI board. So we're really honored that the work that Joel has envisioned 5 years ago is not only now bearing fruit and having real impact in the world, but it's being recognized by people that have a lot more power and influence than the NCRI and can help us be a stronger organization together. So with that, I'd like to introduce my business partner and colleague and friend, Joel.
Okay. Thank you all for being here today.
שר התפוצות עמיחי שיקלי הצטרף אלינו. תודה רבה, אדוני השר. Go ahead, Dr. Joel.
My name is Dr. Joel Finkelstein. By training, I'm a neuroscientist. My training was in understanding how the brain learns by putting animals into virtual reality and controlling their minds with laser beams to reverse engineer how consciousness works in the brain. It turns out that this very intense form of manipulation in a virtual environment looks a lot like what happens on social media and the mathematics of this scale. So it's possible to understand, if we think of these social media platforms as brains, how they're actually predicting real-world problems, and they are predicting real-world problems. The challenge that I think we have is that the amount of information disorder that's growing on social media platforms has become a force that democracies are unable to handle. The people who get on those platforms are unable to handle themselves, and the platforms appear unable to handle what's happening on them. It's not really anyone's fault that this is true. The amount of disorder in the information, when people see these violent memes, when they encounter something so complex that they don't know how to manage themselves or their lives. What happens in the human brain is that we seek closure. We need an explanation for the chaos that's happening to us. And so instead of trying to understand the problems for what they really are, what everyone here will do, we will all do this, is instead of trying to solve a really complex problem, we look for someone to blame. Okay, that closure is an old problem. It's not a new problem. We opened this conversation talking about some language from the Torah. And the earliest inscription that we have on what anti-Semitism is a need for closure in a complicated world. Pharaoh tells his people, hey, these Jews are multiplying, and it sure looks like they're going to replace us. And by the way, they're going to be teaming up with invading nations to take us over. So that myth, this idea that Jews are replacing people, in the modern world, that has two twins. It has two versions. One of those versions is something that people in America are very familiar with. It's called the Great Replacement. And in this idea, you have the notion that there are Jews who are being brought in as immigrants to replace white people with people of color. Now, that idea is then mutated and twisted in Israel, where now Israel is an apartheid state. And it's replacing people of color with white people. These are the same myths. We don't have two problems with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. We have one problem. It's a singular myth about people facing complexities they can't manage, needing somebody to blame, and because of the history of anti-Semitism, having a very clear person or organization or community or nation to do that with. So, with no further ado, I want to show you what our data has shown about this. Now, I thought that because these were so similar, that we would perform scaled analysis on this subject, and what we would see was that these two things must go up and down together. That's what I assumed going into the research. That does not appear to be the case. My clicker's not working.
מי יכול לעזור עם המצגת? אצל מי המצגת? Okay. So we will help you.
That's great. Okay, so here we go. Great. Good. So in order to understand how these two things, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, are related, the NCRI, with the Ruderman Foundation, performed the largest study to our knowledge, with grabbing over 100 million comments to understand how these two things might be related to each other. Going back over 2.5 years on Twitter with over 100 million comments, we note that these things don't, in fact, surge together and sync together in spite of the fact they're so similar. They exist in what we refer to as a polarization pendulum. When one is ascendant, the other actually descends. The other does not have a lot of power behind it. When they are ascendant, when the Great Replacement idea, the New World Order, the globalists are ascendant, this predicts attacks against vulnerable communities. It predicts attacks against Jews and anti-Semitic attacks. But that doesn't happen when the chatter goes down. When the apartheid language goes up, when that myth rises, it also predicts anti-Semitic attacks against vulnerable communities. We can predict where and when attacks against diasporic Jews will occur based on when people are talking about the word apartheid on social media. The signal is carried by social media and into the real world in ways that give us the capacity to forecast where anti-Semitism will heat up down to the county level. The data shows that there's a correlation between this kind of activity and vulnerability for Jewish communities everywhere, and it doesn't matter which one of those myths are ascendant. They both produce the exact same results. That isn't surprising, because what our data suggests is that they're the same exact myth used by two different forms of populism that use that myth to clutch onto power and to feed red meat, to feed their tropes of populism to their base. So we noted that there was a huge change in when these terms were ascendant. When we found that the right was in power, we found that the threats around the New World Order, the immigration issues, the fact that Jews are replacing people in their homelands, that was the trope that became prominent. But when the left took control, it emboldened elements of the far left, and all of a sudden, we saw a moral allergy appear towards the state of Israel, which predicted attacks against Jews everywhere that happened. So we focus on Twitter because Twitter is really a kind of global public square. Our research shows that when trends emerge on Twitter, it's a lodestar for what's going to be happening all over the rest of social media. Although there's competitors now, we see that Pew Research and others have shown that Twitter has a massively outsized influence both on public perception and on the media. So if we want to understand which way the wind is blowing, publicly and internationally, this is a crucial platform for doing that. So the two tropes you mentioned, we present some pretty grotesque memes here that depict them, and you can really see how the similarities they have. I suppose you can look at these tropes and see that there are conspiracies of Jews that are working together to displace ethnic white populations in Western countries by bringing in immigrants. They're controlling industries, they're controlling the banks, and what they're doing is they are launching what appears to be an effort for ethnic cleansing and genocide. When we look at the apartheid libel and we look at the memes associated with that, we find the exact same memes. Right there, you can see now the Jews are a genocidal operation in Israel with their own nation. The Zionists are controlling world events, not a conspiracy of people. And wouldn't you know it, there's a great replacement happening in Israel, step by step. You can see how identical these are in terms of their mimetic structure, in terms of the memes that they have. But what we find with the activity goes beyond just looking at how similar they are structurally. I'm afraid my clicker is not working again. Oh, here we go. Okay, great. What you're seeing on the left is surges of these new world order kinds of replacement conspiracies. And look at what happens. At critical moments in the United States, when COVID first arrives, we see a record spike. That record was nothing compared to the day that George Floyd died. And when the election conspiracies began emerging on Fox News in prominent ways, you had a surge in these suspicions. And finally on January the 6th itself. But notice that after the change of power, when the right loses power, look how quiet that signal gets. While that signal is prominent, this is predicting real world, it's forecasting the real world attacks. It's forecasting the protests. It's forecasting the mobilizations. The populists are using this in order to seed suspicion and seize control. That is what's coming out of the data. Now, when we look at apartheid and we look at the opposite libel, look at what happens here. Oops, sorry, excuse me. Let's go back one slide. There we go. All of a sudden after the election, I suppose now there's a moral allergy to Israel that wasn't there before. That's interesting. We see that human rights organizations begin getting pretty bold. As they're releasing reports, we find bots that are amplifying those reports all over social media. The prominence in the use of these tropes now starts forecasting real-world events. It didn't before. Before, it didn't actually predict attacks against Jews anywhere. It was only after these switches happened that the emboldening occurred, and the trope of apartheid and the libel of apartheid became a campaign slogan for populist elements on the left. And so what we see is that in terms of the pendulum effect, let's take a look at this in ways that kind of give us a summary of the slides. There we go. You can see that under the right-leaning administration, you had a 6x increase of these what are considered traditional anti-Semitic tropes over anti-Zionist tropes. And there's a complete inversion by the time we get to the other side of this, right? When the polarizing pendulum swings the other way, and you have the left assuming power, it immediately switches. Now, we talk about a double standard against Israel. So one of the things that we wanted to do in the course of this research was actually measure just what that standard is. When people are talking about the language of human rights, how often are they talking about Israel? And how often are they talking about other nations? Our analysis suggests that this isn't a double standard, it's a 10x standard. Israel's mentioned on average more than 10 times more than any other nation in the top 10 when it comes to these issues. This isn't a problem for Israel, guys. This is a problem for international human rights. I look at this graph and I think about the people who are screaming about international rights, international human rights. I need to be honest with you. I suspect they don't really mean it. When we look at the worst perpetrators of human rights abuses, we see that this is even worse. With China, it's mentioned 12 times more than China, with the apartheid they're committing against Uyghurs as we speak. 38 times more than Iran, 50 times more than Russia, 111 times more than North Korea. These are places that actually do have settlers. These are places that really do colonize others. These are places that really do commit apartheid every single day. I wonder how it is they're not receiving ample attention. I wonder where that attention is going. So I'm going to skip this slide because we've already gone through this. Now, what I'm showing you here, I think, is crucial to understand. The signal, these are not the same signals. It looks like I'm showing you the same signals. they are not. At the top, you have the terms colonial, apartheid, settler, the rest of them. And below, you have real-world anti-Semitic incidents occurring in the United States, both on college campuses in red and ADL incidents in blue. When the hashtags for apartheid begin surging on social media, they are 65% correlated with the attacks on campuses across the United States. They're 25% correlated by county with the ADL information. The forecasting signal from these hashtags about social justice are forecasting real-world events. The real-world events are not forecasting the signals, meaning that the chaos is coming from the social cyber domain and into the real world. This appears to have directionality. Even as the libels are surging against Israel, this is creating a condition whereby its advocates are forced into silence as their lives become swamped by attacks due to their rank injustice just by virtue of the fact that they are Jewish. It creates an inability for the diasporic community to feel a filial sense of loyalty and a sense of belonging to the broader Jewish community and specifically to the state of Israel. This creates further conditions that endanger Israel internationally as its advocates are silenced in fear as the attacks against them increase, along with damage to Israel's reputation. I'm sorry, I'm having some difficulty here. Okay, good. Okay, so let me summarize where we are so far, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about national security here in Israel. We performed with the Reuben Foundation what I think is the largest study done on the subject of how anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are related. The spoiler alert is that they're essentially the same thing. We quantified the double standard against Israel to understand just how bad that double standard really is and found that it's actually a 10x standard. This appears to be a crisis for the language of human rights, much less Israel. We find that the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, these tropes, they don't emerge at the same time. There's turn-taking, there's a division of labor in anti-Semitism. We note that the social media signal is the forecaster. It's the upstream source of this. And finally, we note that the US political power shifts from left to right appear to precipitate a lot of predicting when these things become prominent themselves. So now there's the question of how this impacts the state of Israel and what it is we can actually do about this to manage the problem given these understandings. I would suggest to you that when I see the polarization that is taking place in the United States, in 2020, a set of riots broke out in the United States. Many of you might be familiar. Where those riots occurred was predicted by activity on social media around social justice. Where the attacks from vigilantes occurred in response to that was also predicted by signals from online groups that were talking about this new world order stuff. This means that the polarization pendulum, the fixation that these populist groups have for anti-Semitism on each side, is being used to feed into a conflict between global perspectives on human rights and national perspectives of autonomy. The populists on both sides are using them in a mode, the polarization pendulum, it fuels reciprocal radicalization. The capacity by which the suspicions and the violence empower the populists on both sides. That may sound familiar to you because that appears to be a process that's happening here in Israel. So what our data suggests, and this is, I think it's worth noting, is that these two forms of populism have a fixation on Jews. So when these kinds of conflicts emerge in Israel, it may be grounds for national security problems, as media that is obsessed with demonizing Israel becomes involved in the conflict. As left-leaning social justice media holds up Jews that they like and demonizes the Jews they hate. Even as right-wing influencers and those on the populist right may bring up the nationalist Jews that they love and demonize the Jews that they hate. This creates a very challenging problem to manage internally. And with no visibility on social media, with no ability to be able to see how this is happening, It can create realities in the ground that the rest of us are simply left to deal with in chaotic ways. So I believe that this research could be essential in understanding the unified interests that the Jewish diasporic community has with Israel itself. These aren't one hatred, two forms of hatred, it's one form of hatred. It betrays the unity in the set of the confluence of interests the diaspora and Israel have together, and suggests that we need to find a way for those who need protections globally and those who have them nationally to reconcile our differences, and to do that on the basis, perhaps, of being Jewish.
This is really an opportunity, I think, as well, to talk about the threats to this type of research. What Joel has been working through here is massive amounts of open source data, open source intelligence. So for everybody here that has a publicly available social media account, largely 80% of social media, that's largely been available to researchers. And there's a bit of a potential shell game going on right now with the CEOs of social media companies. With the launch of ChatGPT, suddenly you have social media company CEOs doing media tours talking about how AI is going to destroy the world. There are real threats from AI to civilization, no doubt. But it's pretty coincidental that 6 months ago, ChatGPT was launched, and launched potentially $1 trillion industry that's based on monetizing open source social media data, publicly available social media data. 80% of the social media data most people and researchers had previously had access to. These social media companies are sealing off brick by brick this open source data. So it is a tremendous threat to the Jewish community, based on what Dr. Finkelstein just outlined for you, that this data is becoming increasingly unavailable to research organizations and the public in the national security sector writ large. I also would be remiss not to really thank you, or Lechner, who's here, CEO from Bright Data, who, when he heard that we were here talking about these issues, has partnered with the NCRI and helped provide us with data through a lot of our research that has helped us do some of the work that we do. So I just think it's something else that lawmakers need to be aware of, and be galvanizing other lawmakers from around the world to understand that these issues happening with social media companies sealing off all of the social media data from the research community and the intelligence field is very detrimental to vulnerable communities.
Thank you very much.